now we get to the real heart or the nuts and bolts, or how about the soup to nuts conversation? We're going to start a new one today, and I'm excited about it because we're going to talk about leadership. That is a field that has so many places to go. Literally thousands of books have been written. There are webinars, seminars, all kinds of programs out there, classes at universities and other places that try to teach people leadership and what it means and how to be a better leader, whether it be a team, whether it be your own business. We all need to work on our leadership at some point and continue to work on it, because obviously if we lead better, then we have better results with the people we work with. So we've got one of the experts. We've got Brad Merkel. He's the founder and president of the Merkel Group. Brad has over 32 years of experience working for one of the world's largest and best managed companies. He's the founder and president of the Merkel Group, and he's an ICF certified professional coach. He primarily works with executives and business owners to improve their performance and also to develop the next generation of leaders. His clients include folks in the energy, chemical, distribution, logistics, utilities, education, food and grocery, travel and insurance, convenience retailing, real estate, and boy, I'm about out of breath. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. Glad to be here.
Well, you've got a broad, and I think that's the point, a broad base of experience in leadership, and we're going to talk about that in your perception. I love the title of our program today, the intentionality of leadership and how to be a better leader. And I know you've got a book that you're writing, which I believe is under the same title, Intentionality?
It is.
Leading on purpose. I like that, leading on purpose. So not just a knee-jerk. Well, let's jump right into it. I want to start by asking you a question and let people get to know a little bit about you. If you can recall, when was the first time that you personally in your career thought about leadership?
Yeah, actually, I remember it very well, Rick. So I was 31 years of age. It was 1993, and I had my first managerial job. Was offered to me, and I went up to manage a division that was I was working in Canada at the time, and it was in a place called Sudbury, a pretty remote area, one of the smaller divisions in the country, and it was an underperforming division, and they sent me at the time, an untested manager, leader, to go and lead that business and to turn it around. And so that was the first time that I really reflected on what was it going to take for me to lead this group of people, most of whom were older than I was, more experienced than I was, and how was I going to actually influence them to take this business to a different place.
Well, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were kind of thrown into the fire. Is that correct? I mean, had you been prepared to be a good leader and to have effective results?
Not so much, and I think this is one of the big challenges that we face in business today, is that especially in large companies, that the people who tend to succeed and get thrown into more senior leadership positions are people who excel at their individual contributor job. So whether that's a technical job or an operational job that they tend to come into when they're relatively young, and they excel at those things, and because they have excelled at those functional, operational type jobs or technical roles, they get promoted to manager. And often it's done without any real full development of what it is. What is it to be a leader? And I do make the distinction between management and leadership as well, which we can get into, because much of what is management is around controlling, defining, and executing initiatives. And much of that can be easy for an individual to sort of step into. But stepping into a leadership role where you're trying to create something new, that's something that we don't prepare our leaders for.
Well, and I'm sitting here, again, I'm thinking about your situation years ago in the 90s when you were sent into that position. it sounds like you were really unarmed and uneducated in the area of leadership. What were the company's expectation? I mean, did they expect you to turn this around by the numbers, or were they evaluating your leadership qualities?
I think in some ways, when companies look to take a chance on someone, at some point in your career, you do have to step up and you have to give people that opportunity to shine and to see whether they succeed. So if someone took a risk on me, which I appreciate, what their expectations were, largely unspoken. Go ahead, this business isn't really performing very well. We need someone to turn it around. Go up there and do your best.
That is very, very interesting. And I see this even in small business, meaning businesses that are owner operated, the owner works in the business. To me is one of the, or part of that definition of a small business, is that I'm working at a job. I'm technically good, so I say, well, I'm a great plumber, or I'm a great IT, or whatever it might be, so I'm going to go open a business for myself. But again, so I'm taking the chance and all the risk that I'm successful. What do you say to those people? I mean, they've got this great technical skill, and now they're going to go open a business with no preparation to manage people or very little, and to be a leader of their own business. What's your advice to those folks?
Well, I mean, the first thing I say is that leadership is hard, and it is an art. There's some science to management, and that's why we have MBA schools, and people can go and get themselves trained and take education around the theories of management. But as far as leadership goes, there's really very little in the form of practical training that allows leaders to really understand what it is and what it's going to take to move their business from here to there. And so the first thing is to acknowledge that you probably don't have the skills or the training to do this. And so you're going to need to do some hard work to do that. And that's what I do in my coaching business is I work with entrepreneurs, with business owners, and with senior executives to help them define their leadership agenda, to help them create the future that they want to create for their business.
In fact, what I hear you saying, you're providing them with a guide or a roadmap, as I like to say, in an area of leadership they really haven't thought about in some cases. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's interesting that you've got me, which is, again, kind of how you were when you got that first opportunity. It sounds like nobody gave you a map or a guide, or did you have a mentor?
I did not have a mentor at that time. I began to seek out mentors, shortly after, as I got myself into those challenges of leadership, and I started to seek advice from others who were experienced and who were my peers in managing similar businesses. And I think that's really important if you're in a company where you have others who are peers of yours in similar type situations, or maybe even have been through it before and are more senior. Really important to build those relationships and to learn from them.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm personally also agree with you 1,000%. I'm real big on everybody in small business where I work. You need a mentor, at least one, and preferably somebody that is paid so they focus on what you have and what you need to do and help guide you through some of these unknowns as well as knowns.
Right.
Well, that's really interesting. So you've got firsthand experience. You know the feeling of what it's like to be put on the front line, armed with just basically your personal background and personal experiences, and I assume a good technical ability, but yet no idea. That's a good story right there. Might make a good movie about because people love the underdog, don't they? Well, one of the things that you're in your book that you're still writing, but some things that I read that you provided and everything, is leadership today is different. And you make some good points about why it is so different, like so many things, of course, under the current health crisis. But in general, business is evolving so quickly. Talk to us a little bit about leadership and why it is different today as opposed to just a few years ago, really.
Yeah, it's different because the pace of change is faster than it's ever been, and businesses are finding themselves in this state of disruption, where and much of that is enabled by technology and the technology that all of us are learning to use and live our lives by. I mean, even right now, many of us have become used to ordering a good percentage of the things that we buy to be delivered to our doorstep, which was just unheard of 10 years ago. And so the world is changing, and companies like Amazon and others are just coming up with new business models that are completely disrupting industries, entire industries. You think about what Uber has done to the traditional taxi industry around the world. And so the pace of change is so quick, enabled by technology. The other thing that leaders face is that the technology that we use to communicate has changed so much. And we all have these very powerful devices, and typically several of them. We have our personal computers we work on, laptops, which means we can take our work with us wherever we go. Cell phones that are more powerful than the computers that I worked on when I first started my career, which allow so many people to access us as leaders and to interact with us, that it's just a perfect recipe for distraction.
Well, and it's a perfect in my opinion, distraction as well as disruption, meaning that it's just so hard. And I find this with clients that I work with and business people. We have roundtables and whatnot. It's easy to get off track.
For sure.
I mean, just it's all about, to me, and I'll mention this in my tip of the week about focus. It's kind of a war cry now because so many people have lost track. And you're saying that leadership today even adds to that distraction or disruption because, again, the technology is all around us. Big challenge.
Huge challenge, and it manifests itself in so many ways, but time management is one of the big ones where leaders just find themselves completely drained because of the way that they are interacting with their organization. Email is becoming a huge overload, which is almost unmanageable. We have so many connections and so many people are communicating by email. And meetings, especially in larger companies, meetings can become just overwhelming. So many people are invited to these meetings and they become habitual, but very little gets accomplished at them. And yet, there's a protocol and there's an expectation that certain people show up at these meetings. And so it becomes a huge drain on your time, and you're not actually being intentional when you're being consumed in these meetings about your leadership agenda.
Yeah, it's like you say, and it's a good point. I had not really thought that deep into it, that in that day-to-day and that leadership and trying to stay focused. I have thought about that, but the things, the distraction, technology, which on one hand can help us so much, help us make better decisions, help us to make decisions we couldn't even make before with any kind of quality information. And on the other hand, it's so easy to get buried in it and make no decision at all, right?
Exactly.
Well, believe it or not, we're to our first break for today. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our first commercial break of the day, and I hope you'll stick around. We're going to continue talking to Brad about a little bit about the current situation and then move into some of the things that you can do to improve your leadership abilities, build a more successful business, build a better team, whatever your goal, whatever your position is now. So please stay with us, and we'll be right back with you.
For business ideas and news you can use, join us on the weekly business hour every Monday at 11 a.m. on Lone Star Community Radio.
Remember to download the Lone Star Community Radio app from your Google Play Apple Store. Bring Montgomery County's community radio with you anywhere with your smartphone or tablet. If you are in the Conroe area, tune in on FM 104.5, 106.1. If you are on your computer, bookmark irlonestar.com as your internet radio station. Lone Star Community Radio, broadcasting 24/7 from the heart of downtown Conroe, Texas.
Path to the Plate is a research-based education program that helps consumers understand how their food choices impact their health, by making the connection to agriculture, learning about how food is grown and produced, and how consumers can make better food choices for themselves and their families. Path to the Plate is all about dispelling myths and misconceptions. Find out more online at pathtotheplate.tamu.edu. We are Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, helping Texans make their lives better.
Hi, I'm Keith O'Connell, CEO coach and business mentor. I've spent 4 decades helping multiple entrepreneurs use my principles to take their businesses to the next level. My methods do not fix your problems, they help you fix them for yourself. I call this process closing strong. Contact me at 713-557-1639 or visit my website at closingstrong.com for a risk-free 30-minute meeting to see how I can help you. Because a business can only go as far as its leader can take it.
The Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service has been dedicated to educating Texans for over a century. In 1915, the Extension Program was established under the federal Smith-Lever Act to deliver university knowledge and agricultural research findings directly to the people. Ever since, AgriLife Extension programs have addressed the emerging issues of the day, serving diverse populations across the state. Texans turn to Extension for solutions in horticulture, agriculture, 4-H and youth, and family and consumer sciences. Extension agents respond not only with answers, but also with resources and services that result in significant returns on investment to boost the economy. Join us Fridays at 1 o'clock for the AgriLife Extension Hour.
It's all about business on the Weekly Business Hour every Monday at 11 a.m. on Lone Star Community Radio.
Well, you're listening to the Weekly Business Hour. I'm Rick Schisler. I'm your host. I'm a Silver Fox advisor and the founder and head of OneBestConsult.com. Thank you for listening to today's program. And I want to mention to you again, if you didn't pick it up, we take email. We want questions, not only about the program today, but about a question about your business. Any of those kind of questions I love to get. So communicate with us. Get on our email list and communicate with other people in the business community out there through OneBestConsult.com. So the email, it's that's just the number 1, bestconsult@gmail.com. That's OneBestConsult@gmail.com. Well, we're visiting, as you probably know, with Brad Merkel. He's the founder and president of Merkel Group, has over 32 years of experience working for large companies. He's an ICF certified professional coach. And you know what I really appreciate, Brad, is that you started, as we talked about in the last segment, where you weren't armed with any leadership training and you were put in charge of a division and that you go turn it around. And I love that. Go turn it around, which is sort of it's swim or drown. That's just how it works, right?
Right.
Well, let's talk about a little bit further some of the things. I think it's very important that we understand what the current situation is. And we talked about that for leadership, about the changes, the technology, everything's being pushed very quickly. And so if I'm a person getting into business or in business or I lead a team or whatever, I've got to run real fast to keep up with everything these days if I'm going to be successful. What are some of the other things that are a challenge today that maybe weren't so much of a challenge in the past?
Yeah. There's a huge challenge going on right now with demographics in the workforce. And so what we see is the baby boomer generation, right, which has been largely, let's face it, running things for the last 20 years or so, are retiring and not just starting to retire, but it's really that generation. We're reaching the end of that generation as leaders in business. And so there's this massive outflow of talent and, more importantly, experience, where those individuals who, like I did, managed businesses for 30-some years, they had seen a lot of things. They'd managed through everything, and the next generation of leaders who are taking their place are quite a bit younger, and they're extremely talented, but they haven't been through the same set of wars, if you will, floods, hurricanes, fires, what have you. and they don't have that hands-on experience of how to handle some of these crises. And so, and that loss of experience is huge in an organization. So equipping those leaders who are stepping into positions of huge responsibility now to really be focused about the way they lead, and as opposed to being more in a managerial and execution mindset is really important. Getting them to step back and see the big picture.
You know, it makes a lot of sense, the trial by fire, so to speak, which we're getting a chance to observe a lot of crisis management these days.
Correct.
Whether it's on television with the federal and state governments, local government, but even right around us in the grocery store business, people that are supplying, and you can tell who the winners are, the ones that have done the training and developed leaders, and the ones who haven't done it. And I think that's something I'm always interested in personally, because I know where to go get my toilet paper, right?
Right.
Because they're the best led company. That's going to be the one that have it first on the shelf. But all kidding aside, companies, I don't know if all folks that are in business really appreciate the void that's being created. I'm a baby boomer, right? Are you a baby boomer?
Yes, sir.
You're younger
I'm
than
right
me.
at the tail end.
Right at
Yep.
the tail, and about how folks came back from World War II. A lot of folks got married. A lot of folks had children. That's where I came from, and it was just a huge surge. And then all of a sudden, it started to tail off. And today, people don't even have children, or there are fewer children being born, where that has its own complications as well. But the idea, I guess, is that, okay, we've got a bunch of people stepping out, so this leaves a wonderful opportunity for those who are equipped to step in. What do you think is the most important thing? If I was the millennial, the next generation, and I'm in the business, whether it's mine or a big company, what is the single most important thing, top of the list, that you would say, that you would tell me as I get the opportunity to step into a leadership role?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for someone in that position is really to be able to make the shift from individual contributor and from what I'll call an operational or executionally focused role to leading other people. And leadership is about influencing a group of other people so that they maximize their effort towards a goal. That's different than laying out a set of tasks and ask your employees, directing your employees to execute those tasks. That's management. That's very important. In a time like we're in right now, it's very important that we execute well and get the shelves stocked. But leadership is about creating a different future and engaging your employees to come with you on that journey. That's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's not something that that generation is well trained to do. So it's getting more into the emotional intelligence, how to connect with your people, how to inspire your people. These are the things that are really critical right now.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. And, one thing you talk about in your book, too, is about collaboration, how important it is to know how to collaborate, to be creative and innovative. And these are skills that they're just not there. There's some training and whatnot. Talk about that a little bit, though.
Yeah, so very important point. I mean, again, think of the environment we're in. There's a lot of innovation going on in the world. There's a lot of disruption going on in the world. And there are many businesses being impacted by that and not knowing what to do, not knowing how to respond, not knowing how to transform. And they get stuck in their heritage business models, and it becomes considered a risk to change, when in reality the biggest risk is doing nothing. And so what we work with our leaders on is designing a culture where people have the flexibility to experiment and innovate. Amazon was asked the question, Jeff Bezos at Amazon was asked the question, how do you deal with failure in your company? And I love his response. He said, At Amazon, we don't have failures. We just experiment a lot. And some experiments don't work out, and that's okay, because the ones that do work out generate so much value for us. So we work with our clients to really work on experimentation and doing it on a small scale and doing it quick and rapidly.
Well, and the idea that, again, back to your scenario, you're in 1990s and you're being put on the ground to turn around a business, not just run it, but turn it, and not being equipped to be a leader, which is so important to develop the real solid growth and longevity of a business, is be able to exhibit the qualities of good leadership. Well, as we kind of come down to the end of the second segment, these folks today, I find people, and again, I'm not necessarily talking about what's happened over the last 60 days or so with the health crisis, but a lot of people that are leading, managing companies, they're tired. They travel, which that whole thing probably will go through a change as a result of the health crisis, but the amount of travel. But, you know, all these people are just worn out. That's my word for it, for a lot of different reasons, and they're not able to be effective. And that's the key with anything, isn't it?
I totally agree, Rick. And I think what we see is overwhelm. Is what I described, what you described as being worn out. I call it overwhelm, and it's so prevalent, and it sort of comes from, it's partly driven by what we talked about earlier, the technology, the email, the accessibility, the overwhelming number of meetings people are having, and it's also driven a little bit by this problem-solving dilemma that leaders have. So there's this urge or this natural reflex for leaders to want to solve every problem that comes their way. And because the communication today is so easy, they see a lot of problems popping up on their screen every day that probably 30 years ago they wouldn't have heard about. Some manager further down would have handled that problem. But today, that communication happens and it bubbles all the way to the top. So then the senior leaders think, well, that's a problem. I know how to solve that. And they start jumping in and they create their own overwhelm, if you will. But in reality, they're not focusing on the right things.
Well, there we are, back to my word focus. And I can't even think of a better way to end a segment, and it's talking about focus, which, again, I'll address personally because, again, I think it's so hard today. Well, Brad, I appreciate it. We're going to take our bottom of the hour break, and we come back. Hopefully, we can continue the conversation for a bit in this part one of our soup to nuts conversation entitled Intentionality-Leading on Purpose. Hope you'll stay with us, and we'll be right back with you.
Not sure who to turn to when you have a problem in your business? Listen to the Weekly Business Hour on Lone Star Community Radio.
Lone Star Community Radio is looking for those who are interested in hosting their own talk show. With monthly and weekly slots available on Conroe's FM 104.5, 106.1, and on irlonestar.com. Start your own podcast, create your first YouTube channel, and be on TV. Contact Lone Star Community Radio online at irlonestar.com or call the station message line at 936-647-3776.
Hi, I'm Keith O'Connor, CEO, coach, and business mentor. I've spent 4 decades helping multiple entrepreneurs use my principles to take their businesses to the next level. My methods do not fix your problems, they help you fix them for yourself. I call this process closing strong. Contact me at 713-557-1639 or visit my website at closingstrong.com for a risk-free 30-minute meeting to see how I can help you. Because a business can only go as far as its leader can take it.
Have a legal question? Are you a resident of Montgomery County? Call 281-645-6344 to talk to a volunteer attorney from the Woodlands Bar Association. We answer the phones on the first Monday of every month at 281-645-6344 from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. to provide general legal information and information about legal resources to Montgomery County residents.
For business ideas and news you can use, join us on the Weekly Business Hour every Monday at 11 a.m. on Lone Star Community Radio.
You are listening to the Weekly Business Hour. This is Rick Schisler, your host, and we are continuing our soup to nuts conversation with Brad Merkel. Conversation entitled Intentionality-Leading on Purpose. Well, Brad, what I'd like to do in this segment, if we can, is just jump right into your book. I realize you haven't finished the book, but it's coming. But you provided me with a lot of good information that you've already put down on paper. And let's talk about this book. Title of the book is?
Intentionality.
There. So that's a good, we're under eyes now in the library, so to speak, and that's good. But let's talk about what you're trying to really communicate in the book. I mean, we've talked about in the last segment particularly about how to be a good leader today, it is difficult to focus. There are so many things, especially with technology. So technology is a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. I guess it requires a balance. It would be one of the ways to look at it. But let's talk about how it is so important for people that are in leadership roles as the owner of a business or working for a large company and teams, whatnot, to be intentional about what they do. Tell us why that's so important today.
Sure. So the reason I decided to write this book, Rick, is that I work with clients, as you mentioned, from a whole suite of different industries, and I find a common set of themes continues to recur. And most of my clients are, at relatively senior levels, managing pretty big businesses, although I do work a lot with that next generation of leaders who are stepping up and facing the challenge of stepping up into some pretty big shoes. And so the book really centers on the 10 most common challenges that my clients find themselves in. And I've tried to put that into a little bit of a framework that helps, make it a bit more digestible. But that's the basis for the book. And the common theme among all of those challenges is really what you mentioned, is about being intentional. And I call it a practical guide to leading on purpose. So a leader needs a mission. A leader needs to have a purpose. And that relates to the strategy of the company and the vision and all of that. But it more so relates to how the leader is going to lead. And so we work with our leaders to develop that sense of purpose for how they're going to lead, and then keep them on purpose. Keep them from being distracted by all of the other things that will take them away and help them and cause them to lose focus.
And you mentioned one thing that was important, and I know we'll get more in detail in a following program, but about time management, because a lot of this seems to, and as I listened and as I read your background material and whatnot for the book, seems to focus or be a discussion generally about time management.
Time management is huge for my clients. Again, there's just such an overwhelming number of initiatives that come their way. It becomes very difficult to have a sense of priority so that you can determine where to spend your time. It's also hard for leaders socially to sometimes say no to an invitation to a particular meeting. It depends what their particular drive is. But often leaders find themselves reacting to everything that comes their way. And that's where the overwhelm starts, as opposed to staying with their framework of what leadership means for them and their purpose.
And you mentioned that word purpose. And I know that is so critical. So, okay, I'm a new guy. I'm new to leadership, right?
Yeah.
I've been in technical roles. I'm real good turning the wrench if I'm a plumber, but now I recognize and I need to step up and be a leader. How do I go about defining my purpose?
Yeah, great question. So it is unique to every company and to every leader, and depends on where you are in your leadership journey. But the one thing that I think distinguishes leadership from management that I really try to emphasize is that as a leader, your primary purpose is the development of your people. And if leaders keep that in mind, they will more often be working on the right things than if they get sort of drawn into, oh, my purpose is to deliver X dollars next quarter. Because ultimately leaders don't do anything anymore. They don't have their hands on the levers. They're not executing. They're leading a team that is executing. And so their primary task is to develop their people so that their people can reliably deliver the results.
Any hints or ideas of how I go from having my hands on the levers to working and developing people, which obviously expands my reach? Any tips that you've experienced or you've seen, challenges even that you've seen people? That's a difficult transition from being hands-on to basically training others to be the hands-on.
It's very hard. It's very, very hard because it's what's made us successful in the past is having our hands on the wheel, on the levers. And so, when we see a new problem, we think that's what we have to do. So one of the share with you a piece of data from a study that I came across that I really love. And what they did is they studied the employee-manager interaction. And they asked employees, when you go in to see your manager, what is it that you want, that you really want from your manager? And then they asked the same question from managers. What is it that you think your employee wants from you? And what we got is a very different answer. So 70% of the time, when employees come in to see their manager, they're looking for validation. They're looking to show their boss that they're doing a good job, to confirm that they're on track, to let their boss know what they've accomplished. 70% of the time, the manager thinks they're coming for a decision. So the manager is not listening for the same things that the employee's communication. Manager is listening for the problem that they can jump on, and so they want to start giving advice. And that is one of the things that I work with my leaders on all the time. So it's about quieting their mind, quieting their questions that are going through their mind, and actually listening, really listening to their people for a change.
That's an interesting point you make, because I can sense that I've been in that position more than once or twice in my career, and I can see that, and that's a very visible thing that you can test if you're in that leadership role or moving into it, is, are you really listening to what folks are saying? And we all claim we listen, but do we listen to the right things? That's very interesting. Well, let's talk about this acting intentional versus reacting, right? I grew up with the story about the fire truck with the Dalmatian dog reacting to the fire, rushing to the fire, putting it out. That was my management leadership training, was get on the bus, get on the fire truck, and go put it out. That's not the way it should be, is it?
No, not at all. Obviously, we have to take information in, and we have to figure out as a leader what, either to respond or not respond. But we work with our leaders to really resist the urge to jump in. I've one leader that I work with who is so customer focused, which is a really fantastic trait. He wants his customers' needs to always be looked after. So what happens is something happens with a customer where the customer is disappointed or customer gives, negative feedback. He cannot resist the urge to jump in and ask his company, his employees, his teams, what went wrong? How could this happen? How are you going to fix it? And so on and so forth. And he does it very quickly. And what it does is it sends his whole team just spinning in a different direction, right? Whereas what we're working on with him is to step back and reflect on that and understand who really is in the best position to go solve that problem. And then how can he build the learnings into his leadership, his visioning, his strategy for and his priorities for his group. So setting priorities is important for him. Solving that particular customer issue isn't his job.
And, it's interesting because that was a management style, or I don't I'm not sure it's a leadership style, but it was that I was exposed to, that when you had an issue, and customer service business I grew up in, critical, was that one issue became a big thing.
Sure.
By the leaders of our business. And yeah, they rang that fire bell, and that truck was out there, and and like you said, reflecting back, everybody was running around either hiding or, you know what I mean?
Sure.
Just the wrong thing was happening, things were happening.
Right.
When you work with somebody to try to develop them, and I'm sure you talk about it in your book, what do you do? Just give an example of one thing you might do to help me transition to become that thoughtful, intentional leader, and use that example, that customer service.
It's about building new habits, right? And building new habits is hard because we have this natural flood of adrenaline that happens. You know, when he sees something happen to one of his customers, he cannot help the adrenaline reaction. But what he can do is he can recognize it. He can, now that he's aware of it, he can feel it when it happens. So what we've created together is, we call it a battle plan, okay? Because he's feeling like he needs to go into battle. Now he has a battle plan, and the first thing on the battle plan is pause, you know? And so it's about creating a new habit around how he can most effectively deal with that. One of the other things, for example, that leader always used to do is immediately fire an email out with how disappointed he was, how could this happen, lots of emotion in the email. Now he doesn't communicate by email. If he does call his team together to talk about that, he calls them together after they've had time to reflect, and he calls them together on a live telephone call where he can be a little bit more of an empathetic leader and ask questions as opposed to, and ask questions and let his team solve the problem almost live for him. And then once he's confident they've got it, he lets them go. And then he's out of it. So it's about developing new habits, taking the old one, recognizing it doesn't work, and developing a new one that you can implement.
Well, and that's just basically changing your habits. So it's so important, but I really don't think many people think about that as far as being a better leader, that you got to change these habits. And I can see that. Well, Brad, I appreciate the discussion we've had today. Next week, we're going to talk about crisis. You put together I think a very special program, very straightforward, very simple, that you presented recently in a webinar about crisis management. Let's take, say, a minute we got left, and tell people what they should look for next week when we have a discussion.
Sure. So obviously we're all dealing with this global health pandemic, COVID-19, and it's changing everything, at least in the short term. And it's changing, it's just affecting every one of us in different ways. And it's affecting some businesses dramatically, as you know. So what I decided to do for my clients is just have a impromptu session where we could talk about crisis management and what are the important things to think about as a leader during this time. How do you manage, how do you support your people? How do you set priorities during a time of crisis like this? And so that was what the webinar was all about, and I'm happy to talk about it. Look forward to talking about it next week.
Well, I think, as you and I discussed off air, that this is obviously a real situation, and I think to kind of divert from the book and what we're talking about, I mean, it's a lot of the principles are at play, but relating and maybe being helpful to our leaders out there now to give them some direction. And again, I looked through the program. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, and it's great advice in my opinion. So folks, I hope you'll join us next week. Brad will be back, and we'll be talking about intentionality, leading on purpose, but how that can be done under a crisis such as this current, as you said, Brad, global pandemic that we're all going through. And I think it's a really appropriate topic. So thanks. Thank you, Brad, for being with us today. Well, Brad, thanks for joining us again. I think our program last week talking about intentionality and having purpose in your leadership was, to me, very enlightening. I learned quite a bit. This week, though, as I had asked you to talk about, I don't know what, crisis management. You did a webinar recently, and I saw the slides, and obviously very germane because we have this crisis going on. And it was really interesting, some of the things that you were offering to leaders to do and handle, hopefully, in a more thoughtful, more effective way, the current crisis as it is, which creates a leadership crisis, right? I mean, so let's talk about that. I mean, you started out and you asked what adjustments people are making. Well, there's all kinds of adjustments. We were talking about off air that people have closed their businesses. I mean, that's one extreme.
Right.
People have closed their front door, but they're still online. Online business is exploding in all categories, whether it be B2B or B to consumer. So let's talk about that. What adjustments should I be making now?
Yeah, so we, as you said, we started this webinar with really two focus areas. The first being, let's address the business imperatives. And then the second being, let's talk about leadership and how we lead through this. So in the business imperatives discussion, we talked about exactly that. What adjustments need to be made right now? And some of them are obvious. There's some that are, beyond a business owner's control. For example, restaurants and other places of social gathering are required to close. So that's been a huge impact. For other businesses who have typically have office buildings and lots of people working together, they've had to go to remote working. So how do you set your people up from home? How do you support them with technology? How do you run your day? Personal protective equipment. I noticed like a week ago or so, you didn't see too many people wearing masks. You go around, even this morning, I visited my mailbox before coming here, and the people working there were wearing masks, and I was glad to see that. It's for their protection. It's for our protection. So starting to really adjust and make real changes. Some of these things, they take us a while to get our mind around, right? I mean, this is a really serious virus going around. But then we say, well, I'm okay. I don't need to make those changes, right? Adjusting to changes in demand. Many people have seen their sales, drop off dramatically. And how do they redeploy their staff? Are there things they can get their staff to do in the meantime that might prepare them for coming out of this? So those are some of the things we talked about.
Well, there's some key things that you mentioned that resonated with me. One is the required changes with regulatory and legislative. I mean, obviously legislation's coming down, particularly loan opportunities, but there are also other regulatory changes being made to try to ease some of this pressure. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, but talk about regulatory and legislative changes. I'm a leader of a business, I'm an owner of a business, and I lead it, or a business unit, or a facility. What do I need to do as far as the imperative of the required changes legislatively and regulatory to be a good leader?
Yeah, I mean, so the short answer is that, where you're required to do something, you need to, that is something that leaders need to really execute flawlessly. And so, there's really, it's not one of these things that you want to try and debate or go against the grain. And so communication, clarity is really clear with your employees and with your teams that this is one of the changes we need to make. It's required. Let's move forward. What I think is a little more interesting than that is the voluntary changes that come along with that. So for businesses that are staying open, for example, how often do you go and sort of disinfect surfaces or wipe surfaces? If you go into a grocery store now, you'll see, folks now wiping down every cart. So those are the more interesting changes, I think, that require leadership decisions that are they're the right things to do.
Yeah, it's all about a balance. One of the things on that list, too, that you had was working remotely. You touched on that. And as I mentioned to you, I had a background in trying to work remotely with or train people 20, 30 years ago, and it was relatively. we have people working remotely, but now we're talking about a company, an entire business, whether it has 3 employees or 300 or 3,000, where a lot of, particularly the white collar, if they say the management, whatnot, and all the support functions, the accounting, all,
Sure.
are being asked to change and work from home. That is so dramatic, though, for a lot of people, and the change came overnight.
Exactly.
So what do people need to do? I'm the leader, and I've got to get all these people not only plugged in and productive, but effectively be able to function.
Right.
And now we've just put them at home with all the distractions and challenges, whether you live alone or you have children, family. What do you do?
Yeah. So one of the first things is exactly what you mentioned, is to try and support your employees with setting up their home workspace so that they can be, productive. Not everybody has a separate home office where they can close the door. And as you point out, children are home from school. It's a totally different, maybe a working spouse is now home and working remotely too. So doing everything you can to support them with the right technology and equipment, sometimes, having a laptop, having earphones, making sure they have good ergonomics and that sort of thing. That's really important. But then you raise the point about how do you conduct work? How do you interact when you don't have any proximity? And that takes a real change in communication. And so leaders really need to be thinking about the frequency of their communication. And they need to be thinking about the form of communication, because it's very easy to gravitate to email communications. They're quick, they're easy, and they get out immediately to as many people as you want. But we still crave some human interaction, and we need to hear some sense of priority in what's important from our leaders.
Right, and I think you're exactly right. You got to change the script of how you communicate. Obviously, your tool set is different or limited, and I think the challenge there is that a leader has to, this gets to that creative part of being a good leader, come up with ways to use that limited tool set to keep people engaged. And I'm experiencing some of that from vendors and others, and I'm watching and listening and seeing who's being effective with it, who's not. And again, I just imagine a company that's never really done remote. It's a whole new world every day, and I think the leader of that company or business unit or whatever, they've really got to focus on this on a daily basis. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's interesting. There are leaders who have their own sort of fixed mindset about what it means for people to work from home. There are businesses who have most of their employees working virtually, and they do very, very well, and their people are very productive. But there are some leaders who think that if my people aren't in the office, then they won't work hard. And I think leaders really need to get their mind around that and essentially set that aside right now, because the data actually shows that people can be extremely productive at home, and oftentimes will work even longer hours in their home office because they're not walking away from it at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. The laptop is still open, and after dinner they'll go back to it. So we see that all the time with people who work virtually.
It's funny you talk about, last year I read about a company that set themselves up from scratch, from the get-go, to work remotely. They do not have a home office.
Right.
Primarily driven by talent. They needed a lot of really good IT talent, and they found it in different places in the country. They couldn't compete in New York or Silicon Valley for that talent, so they designed their program and have over 300 employees and growing. But everybody's, and they do get together on occasion.
Sure.
But it's for, everybody coming together for 2 or 3 days and that kind of thing. But those people obviously have a leg up, if you will, because they've successfully apparently executed that model. But we have to think that way. It's a whole new model. It's not just sending people home and making sure they have a computer and internet and a headset and a microphone and know how to use Zoom or GoToMeeting. It's a mindset of how things are going to flow.
Yeah.
Because my expectations as a leader have to be adjusted
Right.
of what I expect from my team. Is that fair enough?
I totally agree. Your expectations may be adjusted, but again, it depends on your mindset. I think there's no reason why we can't be very effective, at least for certain periods, working remotely. There's really no reason. So I encourage leaders to think about what can be done, what is possible, as opposed to feeling restricted by this. And I think this crisis is going to change the way we work. I think a lot more businesses are going to realize the power of working remotely and leverage it more going forward.
Well, I'd love to see that acceptance
Yeah.
because that's with the internet and we always go into 5G and all these technical things happen. I often feel that we as a country or many of the businesses are behind
Right.
in thinking, you know. The other thing that jumped at me, and you're seeing this, and I actually saw last night on the news, but redeployment of people. The leadership, to me, that's an obvious one that either, yes, I furloughed people or I laid people off or I had fired people, whatever the technical, and every state has different rules and laws about unemployment and all that kind of stuff, plus there's government money for small businesses. But I saw an interesting story last night, which I thought was germane, was a company that was in the toy business up in Pennsylvania and had 30, 40 employees. Well, now they're making hand sanitizer.
Right.
Because some of the chemicals and stuff that they actually did some manufacturing. Well, now they've redeployed about half the staff, brought them back in, and they showed them making this hand sanitizer. And I thought that was such, one, very creative leadership to do that, and two, the fact that they've been able to redeploy and retrain their staff to handle that.
Yeah, great example, of what's possible during a time of crisis. I think one of the things that a crisis always brings out is it brings out the unexpected in people, and it brings out a level of creativity that sometimes we don't even know that we have, right? So it's great to see companies who are able to shift some of their people and their resources towards, really doing something that's critically important right now, which is helping to battle this health pandemic.
Yeah, I have to do a quick mention because it's a point of pride with me. We have a company here in the Woodlands, Euphrasia, I guess is how you say it. But anyway, they manufacture here in our area soaps and things. I don't know if you're familiar with them. And they just started doing the hand sanitizer. Did you see
Right.
the story? It was just fantastic.
Yeah.
And the creativity didn't stop with switching or increasing, but like they needed 2.5-gallon containers. I love that. They couldn't find them because everybody sold all their, so they went over to Igloo and bought 2.5-gallon thermoses. What an innovative, and loaded them with hand sanitizer.
Yep.
And shipped 600 of them out to Arizona, I think, for government use. But I looked at that picture and I said, boy, it's even got the dispenser built right in. But the creativity
Yeah.
to do that and turn it into what I believe is a successful business. So congratulations to all those people in the toy business and,
Yeah, for sure.
and the soap business, so to speak, of being very, very creative. Okay, we've got these imperatives that we look at, and I guess what strikes me is a leader needs to set their priorities. Again, we've got to move off that reactive stage, right, to really thinking about what we do and be interactive and whatnot. What should, in general, be my priorities that I should be looking at, maybe more so than I did in the past?
Yeah. So, excuse me. One of the things that happens in any crisis, but certainly one of this proportion, is you need to set aside your previous business plan, right? I mean, all leaders came into the beginning of this year with an idea. This is what my business plan looks like. These are my priorities for the year, and that is just all out the window. It's not lost forever, but for this time, leaders need to rethink their priorities and reset them for this crisis. And obviously, the first one that comes to mind is just the health, safety, and wellness of employees and customers. And so you see those adjustments being made at the grocery store with the carts, with little markers on the floor keeping people 6 feet apart, with shields in place to protect the cashiers, and with wearing face masks. So I think I applaud all of those changes that have been made. There are economic choices that have to be made. And for many companies, it's about survival. They want to be able to protect their assets so that when this thing is over, they can continue to employ their employees and continue to have a viable business. And so leaders need to be giving a lot of thought about how do I protect what I have so that I can be viable when we come out. And as you point out, there's a lot of thankfully good government help to help weather this storm. But leaders shouldn't just count on that. They need to be thinking about what do they do to protect their assets. One of the other ones that we talked a lot on this webinar about was reputation. So the way that you conduct yourself right now is going to be remembered by everyone. And if you respond the wrong way now, that'll also be remembered by everyone. So it's really important right at this time to be so aware of what your customers, what your employees are going through, many of who may be directly impacted by this crisis. And to respond accordingly so that you protect the reputation of your company. The last thing that we really need to step up as companies and leaders and business leaders is reaching out. It's very easy to get focused on what's happening inside our own little world, but this is a time to reach out to our customers, our big suppliers, to all of our employees, and make sure we're communicating and asking them how they're doing.
You know, you mentioned what really struck me is reputation, because I always admire leaders that, and you got to be careful, I guess, how you say it, but there's opportunities even in this terrible situation to do a good job, to build a stronger workforce, and to really enhance one's reputation by doing those things.
Right.
And so many leaders will focus on, well, I need mask, I need this, that, I need alcohol, whatever, but they're not really looking at the big picture, if you will, the vision. They don't have that vision to say, hey, there are opportunities, not because it's a crisis, but there are going to be so many people that are going to hold back or are going to fold because they don't know how to deal with it. And I'm talking about leaders. What do you think? I mean, the opportunity to be creative and stand out to your customers, your vendors, as somebody that really performed well. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, it's so important. The example you gave about the local business in Fuchsia and what they did, to support the government in this particular case, or another stakeholder, hospitals, what have you. That wasn't necessarily an effort to increase their business, right, or to focus on their core products. It was an effort to step out and do their part in helping this crisis. So reputationally, that goes a long way, and I think their customers and their employees are always going to remember that, right? That's a way to build loyalty, in your business.
You make that point. That's so important. Your employees. In that case, I would assume that their basic business model was not an essential, so they'd have to be closed down. So the people that work there, hopefully they say, gosh, the leaders of this company made something happen so I can keep working.
Right.
Yes, it's hard, a lot of change, but and then I think they've already gotten, in the case of Fuchsia, has already gotten such positive feedback from current customers about what they're doing and supplying them with other, the hand sanitizer is such a big thing, but so does that enhance their reputation with their customers? Absolutely, I believe.
Yeah.
So this is what leaders need to be focusing on, and that's what I mean when I talk about opportunities. It's not dollars and cents per se. Yes, you got to pay your bills, you got to stay in business, but it's about building your reputation, because when this thing moderates and if ends, if there's such a thing, then people will remember you. And like you said, if you act bad, they're going to remember that too, because
Exactly.
we're all keen on things happening the right way. I mean, personally and in our businesses.
Agreed.
Well, let's talk about, for a few minutes that we have left, talk about assessing our risk because that's what it's about. And I have a sense that a lot of small business people, managers, leaders particularly, kind of struggle with risk assessment. They might be able to assess a risk on a new product or a new service, but we're talking about the whole business now. It's almost like we're going back to the beginning. And when we started this unit, this business unit, and now we've got to assess where are we today. And I think in your webinar you talked about even 12 to 24 months out. And you build scenarios. Talk about that with us a little bit.
Yeah, it's so important to build scenarios, to give yourself at least some visualization or some picture of what the future might look like. And this crisis that we're going through, this global pandemic, is so unpredictable that none of us really know how long it's going to last or how bad it's going to be. We wish we knew, we wish we could predict it, but you sort of have to put some bookends on it so that you can at least understand, does my business survive in that scenario? We encourage people to think about 12 to 24 months as a time frame. And why does that sounds like a worst case scenario. I mean, of course, the nation's leaders want to get the country up and running as soon as possible. We all want to. But if we can't come up with a medical breakthrough for this thing, then we're really looking at a vaccine as the last resort of kind of stemming this thing, which is a year to a year and a half away. So we kind of encourage people, think about that as the worst case. It sounds like it's going to be really tough, but it's possible. So what does your business look like if it's 12 or 18 months of, no social gatherings and social distancing and all of this? And then what's the best case scenario? And the best case scenario is not just maybe the economy opens up a month from now, but are there other scenarios such as your business model changes? Right? You're now maybe supplying hand sanitizer when you weren't before, and that changes your business model. That gives you a capability that you didn't have. So what are some best case scenarios, and how do you leverage those? We find that by painting those pictures, it reduces the anxiety that business leaders are going through because there's so much uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think you make a wonderful point there, because basically you're reducing, probably not eliminating, that uncertainty, because I've had to back up, take a look, and what does this potentially look like? Plus, I participated in it, and a good leader will have key people, right, communicate it to the employees, the vendors. This is what we're looking at, and the messaging, hopefully, unlike at the federal level, will be the same.
Right.
So the confidence level can go up. I think that is really, really important. One of the things that when you talked about risk, you talked about what would happen if we don't do anything. And I still think there are a lot of companies, yes, people have rushed to apply for loans to cover payroll, and of course that system just crashed, and that's okay. That's an action more, a reaction more than a thoughtful in many cases. And I'm not saying that it's a negative thing, but it's where a lot of attention's been focused and meanwhile we do nothing with the rest of the business.
Right.
I mean, how dangerous is that?
It could be very dangerous. Again, until you understand what some of the likely scenarios might be, you can't really have a good framework for evaluating the do-nothing case. Do-nothing might be okay for 1 or 2 months, but it might not be okay for 18 months. So that has to be taken in context. I also think that it's a really important question to ask, how will your competitors respond, or how are your competitors responding? So by virtue of you doing nothing and your competitors making a change, that changes the whole dynamic for how well you're positioned at the end of this thing.
You can literally watch your revenue just dribble away. It may have had that sudden impact because you had to shut your doors, but then you're right. Reading about a small business in the Houston area where they had a certain amount of online, but they had a storefront, a nice storefront, clothing business and accessories, and they were forced to shut the doors. But he reported that his sales last month were up 5% over the same month a year before. Total sales. Because he started shifting back in January, February, and putting more emphasis, changing his online presence.
Right.
So it's possible, it's doable.
Right.
For many businesses. Now, I think if you're selling into the oil field, you may have some real challenges that are way beyond, as they call it now in Texas, the double whammy. Let's talk about leadership and what it is and isn't. And I think it's important. I mean, it's a quick checklist, but for those of us who perhaps were trained incorrectly, it might cause us to really work to change our habits. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, so leadership, when people think of leadership, they often think it's associated with title or position or seniority. If that's the CEO or the president, they must be a leader, right? They must be the leader. Sometimes leadership is associated with behavior. A person who is very commanding or very forceful, well, that's a real leader. And of course, there is the management, the term management, which is used when we need managers. And good management is really important, especially now. If you take something like building a hospital in a convention center in 4 days, and you think about the logistics that it takes to do that, I mean, that is unbelievably flawless management and execution, right? And it took some leadership too. But leadership is not all of those things. It has nothing to do with seniority and position and title. Anyone can be a leader. And leadership is really a process. It's not necessarily a single action, but it's a process of influencing others to maximize their effort towards a goal. That's one of the best definitions that I've found. It's from a great article in Forbes magazine. And so think about that for a minute. It's about influencing others so that they will maximize their effort towards a goal. And that's difficult to do.
Well, and that makes sense. I remember an expression similar, a little more acute that I was taught was leadership is, or perhaps good management was the way it was more explained to me, because we never talked about a lot of leadership, but it's getting people to do something they don't want to do and like it, right? We've heard that. So getting people to perform in all circumstances, the way I distilled it out, and still be effective. But I think that's important to take stock of what's going on. Right now, people are responding, as we've discussed, in different ways. Talk about that a little bit. Is there some encouragement? There's got to be, to help people see this a little clearer so they respond as a leader in a more effective, correct manner. Talk about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, so the one exercise that I led on this particular webinar, and I work with a lot of my leaders on this, is to take a few quiet moments to think about the type of leader you want to be during this crisis. How do you want to show up for your people? What does great leadership look like for you? And just literally write down 2 or 3 words that describe that for you. And then ask yourself the question, how do I normally react when I'm in a stressful situation? And write down those words and take a little bit of an inventory check. Do those 2 lists look at all the same, or do they look completely different? For most of us, they look completely different. The leader that we want to be is calm and confident and influential and enthusiastic. And the leader that we are when we're stressed out is panicked, rushed, stressed, impatient, right? And sometimes not really behaving in the most constructive ways. So we ask people to contrast that because it's about awareness and consciousness of your leadership approach. And if you're not aware of it at this point in time, you're going to get dragged into your normal stress response. And that's a natural thing. We're all actually trying to survive this crisis. And we're in survival mode. So that is taking over the way we're showing up to our people. And I think it's really important that leaders get a hold on that.
You know, one of the biggest challenges in that area, and then we'll kind of close on some things I think that you pointed out about leading remotely, which I think is great advice, but is the fact that it's something I really push, and that's fit with what I'm doing. So I often talk about fitting into the business I'm starting or I'm developing, make sure my personality, I'll use left-hand column of what you talked about of
Yep.
how I react in this case versus what I would like to be doing. Because change will take you so far personally, and you'll find yourself reverting back to what's natural.
Right.
And so I think it's important that people find ways to be the leader they know that's needed, but that they can repeat it, that they're comfortable with it. Because if you don't, eventually it shows, right? It
Correct.
happens. And I've been there and done that. We've got a few minutes left, a couple minutes, in fact. Let's talk about, and this was interesting, how to be an effective leader where people now are working remotely. Okay, so you got a team, you got a business, and everybody had to go home because you had to shut your door. You're not essential,
Yep.
if you will. What a big word today. I'm not essential anymore, non-essential. Talk about some ideas as a leader that would help me be more effective.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit earlier about making sure you support your team, your employees with having an effective workspace at home. That's important. Leveraging technology. What people need at this time is they need frequent communication and they need candid communication. They need to know exactly as much as you can possibly share. We often get into this, especially in larger companies, scenario where the senior leaders are talking about all the potential implications of this. Will there be layoffs and so on and so forth? But none of that really gets communicated. So all that people think is, well, they're off in a dark room, determining our future. You need to be more candid. You need to tell people that everything's on the table, even layoffs. And this is why why we're thinking about it. And we're doing everything we can to avoid it, but, be candid. And it's almost like those scenarios. You're giving people a sense of what the scenarios, the boundaries are. It's important that people get meaningfully involved in the change. So if there is a change in your business plan, and take the example you gave of Infusia taking making a new product, get your people involved in that. And they obviously did get involved, and they created a unique, innovative solution with the containers. So that's a great example of meaningful involvement where everybody felt like they contributed. I think it's really important to, this is something that we spent a fair bit of time on in our call, that leaders are taking the time to listen, to genuinely listen, because there is that dichotomy right now. There is a need to give instruction on and direction on certain things that must be done, but there is a real need to listen, and that's being overlooked a little bit. And so we're encouraging our leaders to really take the time to ask questions of their employees and to be quiet and listen to their answer.
Well, it kind of gets back to what we said earlier in our first program, our first part of this conversation about, I guess I call it effective listening. Be sure you're listening. Don't be on one track and they're on another track. And I would 1,000% agree with you that, particularly in times like we're in now, where there is a crisis, whatever the cause, because people generally are going to be nervous. And they walk into that conversation being nervous. Yeah. And so, again, I look at it a real opportunity for good leaders to be that calming voice that says, we have a plan, and you're part of that plan, and this is what we need you to do. Right. Great opportunity for business.
I'll give you a quick example that some of our folks found real useful, is that I had one leader who was very caring about his employees and very empathic. And so he was asking his employees, how can I support you? And over again, he found that they were not responding to that question. So they were saying, oh, you must have a lot on your plate, boss. I'm okay. Thanks for the offer, but I'm okay. And so after a while, we kind of invented a new approach. And we came up with the question, what is your biggest challenge right now? And so he started using that with his employees. Just, what is your biggest challenge right now? And listening to the answer. And that gave him the opportunity to really figure out what it was he needed to do to support his employees. So it's just a simple change in the question that you ask generates a whole different set of actions in terms of how you can support your teams and your employees.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope folks listening to this will write that one down because it's all about phraseology, but it's what is it that you want out of that question, so be sure you ask it correctly. Well, Brad, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I appreciate we kind of got off onto this leadership during crisis, but again, I feel it's very germane. Obviously, where thousands and thousands of businesses are displaced, so to speak, right now off their business plan. And I love your encouragement. Put it in the drawer, put it in the notebook, put it aside, but have it available because times will get better. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you've enjoyed our continuation of our Soup to Nuts conversation with Brad Merkel, and I encourage you to listen next week. We'll have part 3 where we're going to talk about the 5 pillars. This is a simple, straightforward roadmap on how you can become a more effective, intentional leader, have an intentional purpose in what you do as a leader of your business, your company, the unit, your team, wherever you are a leader. So please plan to join us. Thank you. Well, thank you. We've got Brad Merkel back again. This is part 3 of our Soup to Nuts conversation talking about intentionality and leading on purpose. Well, Brad, I think we've had a couple of really good conversations the past couple of weeks. And again, thank you for diverting a little bit and talking about the crisis management related to the current health crisis. I think that that webinar that you held and being able to share some of that with our listeners is well timed because I think a lot of folks need some kind of reassurance, need some guidance. And I think your webinar provided that as far as being a good leader in a time of a crisis. But today we're going to get back on our original track, and we're talking about the book that you're writing and some of the methodology that you use in your practice as a coach. And you have developed the 5 pillars of intentionality, which I like. It's a great thing to track because we're talking about habits and changing habits. Mm-hmm. And all of us have a habit, at least one, I'm sure. I know I have more than one that I'd like to change, and I know how difficult it is. So let's jump right in and talk about that so that we can help folks that are listening who are leaders to be able to more effectively focus, as you say, and prioritize their agenda, their leadership agenda. And that, to me, is so, so important in being successful. So we've got 5 pillars. Let's start. We got integrity. I noticed they were all I's, too. What's about that? What's the I's? Tell us about it.
It just happened what I was really looking to do is create as I mentioned, I think on one of our previous discussions, create a model that would help to deal with the most common leadership challenges that my clients were facing. And as I really thought through that and kept inventory of some of those challenges, I came up with 5 challenges that were really internally based, and then 5 challenges that were more externally based in terms of how they showed up with your people and with your teams. As I worked through them, I could find that there was a connection between the internal behavior and the external challenge, if you will. And as I worked through that, I came up with this model with the 5 pillars. So they do start with I's. So it's integrity is the first one, and then we have initiative, which is the verb initiative in terms of getting things done, creating momentum in your organization. Then we have impact, which is about working on the right things, making sure that the things that are your organization and you as a leader are doing are creating impact in the world. The 4th one is influence, which is something that we all need to do as leaders. It is really the way that leadership occurs is through influence. And then the last one that I talk about, which is so needed in today's world, is innovation and how leaders develop an innovation culture in their organization.
Well, you cover the waterfront there, and again, the five eyes, okay? Well, I think you probably have a lot of fun with that. But let's jump in and get a little more detail. The first one, if you will, is integrity. And in the visual that we have here in the studio, and if anyone's listening and would like a copy of this, please let either myself or Brad know. At the end of the conversation, Brad will give you his contact information, and I provide it throughout the show. But if you'd like to see some of this information, because I know I'm a visual person, so it's available, I would assume, to share. But integrity, okay, the first I, integrity. Let's talk about that, because you've got I guess, a base and then a top on this of communication and accountability. So kind of give us a synopsis of that and what it means.
Yeah, so there's a great piece of work on integrity that was done by Warner Earhart and Michael Jensen, and I had the chance to go through some training in that regard. And the way that what I learned from that is that integrity, and I worked in an organization that where integrity was part of our core values, my entire career. So I thought I had a good understanding of it, but in reality, Earhart and Jensen look at integrity as a functional model, as really a function. So it either works or it doesn't work. And what I reflected on is that you can have an organization that believes in integrity as a virtue. So people will, for example, strive to be honest and ethical and so on and so forth. But in that same organization, you can have people who actually don't practice integrity at all. They may show up late for meetings. They may not show up at all. They don't deliver what they say they will deliver. They don't deliver it on time. And so those are breakdowns that we have. And so what I've found is there are two keys to sort of managing that with your team as a leader. And the first is in the way that you communicate. And the second is the way that you implement a system for accountability. So I can chat a little bit about that.
Well, accountability's sort of self-explanatory in itself, but I'm curious, and communication is for all fact, but I guess the first key point is you've got to bring it all together, right? The communication, the accountability, the integrity.
Yeah.
I'm a little curious, though, and you mentioned the two individuals you work, is integrity is a functional item, but I'm sitting here and I've got a business and I say I've got 30 employees and I'm trying to be the best leader I can because I want to build a really successful business and have good people and all the right things. But integrity, how do I build that pillar? Because I'll have people from different walks of life working in different jobs, from, say, the guy that is the janitor all the way up to the guy that is my controller or whatever, different qualities of background and education and qualifications. And now I want, which I think is important, I want to focus for a moment on integrity.
Right.
How do I make that happen?
Yeah, it can be a real challenge because everyone brings a different interpretation of what integrity means to them, right? And I think when it comes to business and when it comes to leadership, what is more important than anything is having clarity and absolute clarity in terms of expectations, and having some contracting that exists between, let's say, a supervisor and employee. That allows both parties to have input into that contract, right? And so when you have a situation where I find often with my clients there are two types of situations. One is the manager is a real visionary, and they will talk about their vision ad nauseum, right? And sometimes it can be very inspiring, but at the end of their speech, employees are left wondering, so what do we do next? Okay, where do we go with this? The opposite end of the spectrum is the manager who is very directive, who literally is instructing people on what to do next. And so how do the employees react to that? Well, they will understand what they've been told to do. They may not have much buy-in to it at all. right? Because they've just been instructed to do something and they don't know why. So what we need to do is find some common ground in between those two extremes where there is a dialogue between the manager and the employee. And that dialogue, that conversation includes really clear and concise contracting in terms of what the expectation is, when it will be delivered.
Well, and the payoff from having a company that one of the goals, or if you will, the pillars, is integrity. I can see how that would absolutely, in the long run, particularly pay off, particularly in reputation and whatnot. One of the things, I got to digress for a moment, I didn't explain to people, and again, we don't have that visual, but is the base of your pillars, here in the case of integrity, is communication. And those are what you call internal. These are the actual, I'm the leader, and these are habits that
Right.
so I need to be a good communicator. Is that a simple way to say it?
Yes, you need to be an effective communicator.
Okay.
Yes, and there's a difference between good and effective. Good can sound good, and it might be very articulate, but effective means that you're causing something to happen.
And then at the top of the pillar, the cap, if you will, is accountability under integrity. And these are the external, in other words, systems and support. So you start at the bottom with yourself, I assume. You work up, and so we're trying to communicate and change and implement and strengthen integrity in our
Right.
company. So that's where accountability then of and from the organization comes into play.
Right. And accountability discussions are sometimes difficult, right? Sometimes we don't complete the task as it was, envisioned, for example. And there are a whole set of reasons for that. And often we spend our time in organizations going over the reasons, but not getting to the real solution. And so I think that's where having a really good accountability system is crucial.
I personally happen to believe that's one of the keys to success of a business, is to be able to have people who are accountable and can be accountable and are accountable.
Right.
And you have to build that. It doesn't happen with just a vision speech, as you mentioned
For sure.
earlier. Well,
Absolutely.
the next I, if you will, is initiative. And at the base, you're talking about the leader. It's about time management, something we kind of touched on. And at the top, the cap for the external is problem solving. Talk about, okay, time management. I guess we get what that is. As a leader, I've got to be a good time manager. I don't have a choice if I'm going to be an effective leader, right?
Yeah. For sure. One of the things that we ask our leaders to take inventory of is we ask them to kind of go through a typical week. And we ask them to look at all of the meetings and how they spent their time and categorize it in 3 buckets. We ask them to categorize, was this great work, which means it was innovative and adding value to the company? Was it good work, which means I was doing my job description? Or was it bad work, which is literally a waste of time or, meaningless overhead? And what we find is, not surprisingly, too much of our time is spent on either bad work or just simply executing our job description. And when you're talking about leadership, you need to be shifting the percentage of your time that gets, focused on great work, on creating a future. That's innovative and value-added work. It's hard work. It's thinking. It takes time. And so most leaders don't set aside time for thinking in their calendar. So that's one of the things that we work on.
Yeah, and that makes so much sense. So now we've got the pillar of initiative, people taking initiative, if you will. That's one use of it. So we're at the top. We're trying to build systems of problem solving. How does that work?
So we talked about this a little bit in our first discussion, but we have this cultural issue in many companies and in our society in general, where we want to jump in and solve problems. And as a leader, jumping in and solving problems is not usually your job. So we focus with our leaders to do a couple of things, to ask questions like, why am I invited to this meeting? Or do you need my authority in this meeting in order to move forward? And so this becomes a couple of ways of leaders stepping back a little bit and encouraging their people to actually solve problems themselves, bring them solutions as opposed to bringing the problems to the leader.
Well, and excuse me, you gave an example in our first program, first part of our discussion about the individual who jumped on customer service issues like many business owners do. Particularly, I think if they're engaged, they do, because it's the lifeblood and they get it.
Right.
But then they bring a reaction that is basically becomes negative or counterproductive.
Correct.
And it's so important. So I think obviously having the initiative, problem solving, the more people you can teach, and you're all the way down to the janitor in my example. The janitor has issues that come up. Can they find a better cleaning solution, whatever it might be, in solving problems to give us a better, cleaner work environment? I mean, and their ability to do that. So it's a trait, if you will, that you want your company to be really good at, and I get that. The next I is impact. Now that's interesting to me as a leader. I want to be impactful, right? Or I should. I mean, that's why I'm there. I want to have impact. Sometimes it's not the right impact, but I want to have impact. Let's talk about that. You talk about prioritization, which to me is at the base for the leader to work on as a leader, to prioritize, which is kind of folds into time management.
Not necessarily. I distinguish it from time management in that time management for my leaders, for any leader, really has to be how they themselves are managing their time to have maximum impact. But when I think about prioritization, you're thinking about setting priorities for the whole organization. And what I find is too often there's just simply too many priorities. We have initiative overload happening in every organization at every level. I worked with one CEO who had a very elaborate system for managing his projects and priorities. And he had, when we first started working together, 50 projects that he personally was providing some regular oversight to. So they couldn't possibly do 50 projects every week or every month. So they had an elaborate system of scheduling a certain number of these projects that came up for review. But nobody understood which of those projects was important, which was more important than another. So we eventually whittled it down to 10, and we put 40 of them on hold. And we said, we'll move the 40 forward when we finish the 10. But that's prioritization. But there's another element to prioritization that I think is really important, Rick, and that is setting priorities for your entire company, which stem from your vision and your strategy. But they are not strategy. They are priorities that essentially govern everything that your employees do. And this is a very difficult piece of work for leaders to do. People can't remember more than 3 or 4, so you don't want to have more than 3 or 4 priorities, okay? But the priority that I'm talking about is not finish project A by, April 30th. The priorities are more global in nature, so they might be, we will have a top cost structure in our industry. We're going to be one of the lowest cost, providers in our industry. And by having a priority like that, every initiative and every project that the company works on can always be seen through that lens. How does this project help us deliver that priority of being the most efficient competitor in our industry? And when employees get that ingrained and it starts to become part of their everyday work, that's when you start to move yourself against your competitors. So very important to have those clearly articulated, and too many companies are more focused on that list of 50 projects than the real critical priorities.
Well, and you make a lot of sense. It's kind of like what is it? I've seen companies, GE I think was this way, at least publicly, that they want to be number 1 or number 2.
Right.
And if we're number 2, we're working on being number 1 or something like that. So that was a priority for their business. I think the Chinese as a country have adopted, apparently, it's been reported, a similar thing in what they do, which is on a scale that's just unbelievable. But the idea that I do that in my little 30-employee business, that I have a priority of where I'm generally taking the company, I think that's important.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of things you almost want to print up and put them on the wall or whatever.
Exactly.
So everybody is on that page realizing we're pushing to those priorities. Delegation, that's the end cap, as I call it, or the top cat.
Yeah.
So in order to have that impact and in a positive way, impact my priorities as the leader that I have set, we've got to be able to delegate. That makes so much sense.
It makes perfect sense, and it's how organizations are designed. I mean, they are designed with hierarchy in general and with clear job descriptions and so on, yet we find ourselves too often as leaders being pulled into someone's else's job description. And so that's one of the things that we really try to get clear on, is how do you work at your pay grade? And constantly ask yourself when you're presented with a problem or a situation, is this, in my pay grade to solve, or is there somebody else in the organization who's better positioned to solve this? That's a tough question because we have a natural desire to jump in and help. One of the things, one company that I worked with had such a customer service orientation that they brought that same orientation to the way they dealt with each other inside the company. In other words, if someone asked for something, everyone wanted to jump in and do their best to help that person, right? And on one hand, you say, well, what a beautiful culture. Everybody's supporting each other. But what happened is it created a lot of overlap and a lot of distraction. And people were doing things that they weren't focused on their priority or their job description. They were doing someone else's job. And so you need to get really clear and enable people to say no. That's tough.
Boy, that's a discussion in itself.
Right.
Teaching oneself to say no, but so important.
Yep.
Well, next up, influence. We all want to have influence. As a leader, obviously, we want to be influential and bring influence to the table. And at the base, you talk about preparation and how that is so important to developing influence. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So preparation is so important, and it comes back to time management in the sense that when you're in a state of overwhelm or you're just got so much on your plate, it's so very easy to walk into a meeting unprepared, not having read what the meeting is about, not having read the briefing materials in advance, not having thought about, well, how does this topic fit in with my priorities that we talked about earlier? And if it doesn't fit in with my priorities, how should I address that as a leader? What questions could I ask this group? And then coming into that meeting fully prepared to have an influence, to influence the group in the direction that is needed. Too often we find ourselves just reacting in the meeting, coming in as a leader and seeing something and having questions and firing questions off and asking, what about this, what about that, testing. But we actually could have done a lot of that preparation and been much more impactful and much more influential throughout by having our messages prepared in advance.
Yeah, and that goes back to me to the basic preparation to do your work on a daily or weekly or monthly basis. And, one of the things that I always admired about Winston Churchill, based on what's been written, is how he prepared his speeches, which was a main priority with him. That was his ability to deliver that message to the country in a crisis time, but he spent hours practicing, changing, and so if you don't get it, preparation, and it paid off.
Yeah.
Because he was able to lead, apparently successfully, from everything I've ever read,
Right.
or very successfully lead, in that case, a country, which happened to be his business. But it's always there for preparation. Mm-hmm. And top listening, we're back to listening again.
Yep.
We need to teach a class on effective listening. I'm telling you, this is important.
We do. Because influence only happens when you're listening, right? People misinterpret that a lot, and they think that, if I'm the leader and I give instructions, then I've influenced people. No, you haven't. Influence only happens when you listen first, and you truly understand and put yourself in the other person's shoes. And so one of the things that I work with my leaders on is actually how to be quiet, which is very hard for most managers and most leaders. One of the things that I challenge them to do when I first start working with them is every meeting you go into this week, I want you to be quiet for the first 15 minutes. Don't say anything other than introduce yourself. And they all come back to me saying that's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it puts them in a different mindset where they're actually paying attention to people and what they're saying. And they're not jumping ahead, and they're not inferring, and they're not making assumptions. And it creates a whole different kind of dialogue.
That's a wonderful, wonderful exercise. I have a client that I was working with recently, and they, from old school, which is a good thing in my mind, but they had that characteristic that they were misconstrued, that they were going to do, we got to do it their way or the highway, which was never intention. What it was, they carefully prepared and thought through, so then when they had that meeting, they knew where they wanted to get from A to B.
Right.
But they were not an effective listener, and even to the extreme, some people interpreted it as very negatively, saying, well, they're not open to suggestions, which they were. But because of the way they presented themselves and felt like they had to make that first conversation in charge, and
Right.
plus their tone and everything, because they were problem solver and they had spent time, because they knew about it,
Sure.
or more reflective on it before the others. So, we had to, like you say, got to back down, and I like your exercise. I may steal it. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Just be quiet.
Yeah.
Be quiet. Well, last but not least is innovation. Boy, what a thing. Innovation, change is happening all the time. Leader, you say, needs to work on being inspirational, being inspiring. And what does that entail? That's interesting.
Well, one of the ways that I like to describe this is to try and create a culture in your organization that is, instead of a no, we can't culture, to a yes, we can culture. And quite often, and you see this in any business, no matter how small, you have to have some rules and some policies in place, right? Customer brings back a defective good, or customer's unsatisfied with your service. What's your policy? Well, it might be no refunds, or it might be what have you, right? So we all have these policies in place, and it's just so easy to say, well, that's our policy, that's how we work, that's the structure, so the answer is no. And what I challenge my leaders to do is to create an entire culture where, if you're doing some of these other things we talked about, and you have clear priorities, and you are listening all around, internally and to your customers, that you can create a yes, we can culture. That's a very inspiring place to work. That is a very motivating place to work, and it's what this current generation is looking for in their work. They want to make a contribution. They get it. They want to make a difference in this world. They're not showing up to work 9 to 5 and take home a paycheck. So it's real important that leaders focus on that and really think about how do they inspire their people.
Well, and I would absolutely agree with you 100%, particularly when you're either young working with old, or old working with young, or however you want to. You're going to have a mixed group, but you've got to be inspirational to get the response from people who may not want to respond simply because of your age.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's more and more diverse.
For sure.
I ran into that early in my career where we had women managers, supervisors in the industry we were in. They were the best. And I mean, so if you wanted the best, find one for a lot of reasons. But we had some older men working in the positions in the production, and we would have resistance because of that was the thought process then, that, well, I don't work for a woman, you
Yep.
know, and these were good production people. They were good people.
Yep.
But we had to break that down, and that was one of the common challenges that we had, particularly in the better workforces, because again, they had the older people, a lot of men, some women in the production lines they were the ones with the experience.
Right.
So basically teaching the leaders, if you will, in that case managers, that you need them and, you know, they've got, so how do we build this connection? And what you're talking about. On the cap of this pillar of innovation, you have experimentation. And I think that's a pretty good place to, as we wind down our conversation, to be at. Experimentation, boy, that fits, doesn't it? I mean, it's great.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in our first chat as well, but it's so, if you don't experiment, you don't innovate. It's as simple as that. And so then you ask the question, fine, well, why don't companies do more experimentation? And more often than not, what it comes down to is not necessarily business risk, but it comes down to personal risk, right? So if I'm going to propose something new here and it's my project and it fails, then I have a black mark, right? And that's worse than if I have no marks at all. So I'll just keep my head down and keep doing my job. And so we work with our leaders to really try to break that mold of creating a safe environment for their people to take personal risk, put new things in place, always be experimenting, trying things different with their customers, with their business, to see what works. We don't know until we try it. And when it fails, it doesn't become a black mark. It becomes something that didn't work. What do we learn from that? And you build this library of learnings that actually becomes a competitive advantage over time. So I think this is really important, something that every business needs to do more of.
Yeah, I absolutely, I mean, I'm sitting here kind of getting excited because, like you say, the innovation is not going to happen without the experimentation, and the ability as an external that you get the people who work for you. And it may not be everybody, at least in my experience, but you get people buying into that, hey, it's okay to experiment, to try, my example earlier, the janitor to try a new cleaning solution that may,
Sure.
you know, he might speak to his supervisor and say, will you buy me a gallon of this or that? Or I think I've heard about it from other people. And that's the thing is the experiences that people are having, what they see and hear is different for everybody.
Right.
And so you're plugging into that resource and pulling it. It's like a collaboration,
Right.
indirectly, as I call it, where you bring all that up. You know, it used to be we'd rely on salespeople to tell us what customers might say.
Right.
But that's kind of where it stopped.
Right.
But it's really the whole organization, right?
It's the whole organization. I mean, why do we have this notion that the best ideas only come from leadership or senior management? That's just completely false, right? So I love what Google does. My son worked there for a number of years, and you may know this, Rick, but they give their employees about 10% of their time to work on any project of their own definition. That, you know, could be in any, that it has to be related to their business, but it could be completely new and innovative. And they really enable that. They allow them to access other people in the company and to engage other people to come on board with their project and support them. And so they kind of learn a lot of leadership skills even as they go through this. But that opens up the whole company, every employee in the company, to thinking about what could we do better? How can we innovate? How can we experiment? And they get to actually have a stake in it. They're the people who know the business best.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The person who's doing it each and every day, or the janitor who's cleaning up after all those people and what he or she
Right.
sees. So, great conversation, great soup to nuts conversation. Brad, you're writing a book, Intentionality is leading for purpose. I guess I should say it, leading for purpose. When is this book going to be available? Any idea?
Yeah, I'm working on it a little bit every day. I'm hoping to finish it this summer, and so as soon as I do, I'll certainly let you know about it and maybe come back and have another conversation.
Yeah, I'd love it. Now, if people want to get in touch with you and talk about maybe what we talked about today, or they're looking for a good coach to work with them and they're leadership challenges and whatnot, what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
You can find me at my website, merkelgroup.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me on a number of places. But look for the Merkel Group, and I'll give you my email, and you can keep it in or put it in your links, perhaps. But I'm more than happy to take questions, or anyone who would like to reach out. I'd love to have a conversation with you.
Great way to be innovative, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed your presence. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our Soup to Nuts conversation about intentionality, leading on purpose. I think that's a great, great observation. And I look forward to seeing your book, Brad. Thank you again so much.
Thank you, Rick. Much appreciated.
OneBestConsult.com, a community of small business owners where you as an owner can find answers to the most pressing business questions you have. Not sure who to turn to when you have a challenge in your business? Turn to the folks at OneBestConsult.com. That's the number one, bestconsult.com, where you can always find advice you can use based on common sense business experience. Join our community of like-minded business owners at OneBestConsult.com.